People always ask me what the worst case of my career was. They expect me to mention a serial killer or a hostage situation or some cartel investigation that made the evening news. I usually smile and tell them those cases ended the way they were supposed to. The bad guys were caught. Families got answers. Files were closed. Then they ask why I retired after only 15 years with the FBI, even though I was on track for a promotion. I never answer that question. The truth is, there is one file that was never officially closed. It never appeared on the news. There were no press conferences, no documentaries, no arrests. According to the Bureau, it simply became inactive after all investigative leads were exhausted. That sounds clean and professional until you realize that 23 people disappeared during that investigation, and not a single body was ever recovered. I was the lead agent during the final months of that case. I have spent years trying to convince myself that I missed something obvious, some small detail that would have changed everything. Instead, I keep waking up at the exact same time every few weeks because I hear the same voice that I heard inside that abandoned sheriff's office. My wife thinks it is just nightmares. My therapist says it is survivor's guilt. Maybe they are right. Or maybe there are some investigations that never actually end. This happened in the fall of 2018 while I was assigned to the Violent Crimes Task Force out of the FBI field office in Colorado. It started like any other Monday. I was halfway through a cup of coffee when my supervisor walked into my office carrying a thick brown evidence folder. He tossed it onto my desk without saying a word. That alone caught my attention because he was the kind of man who always explained everything before assigning a case. He stood there for several seconds looking unusually tired before finally speaking. "We're taking over a missing persons investigation from the county sheriff's office." I nodded and opened the folder. The first photograph showed a smiling family of 4 standing beside a hiking trail. The second photograph showed their abandoned SUV parked near a forest access road. The third photograph was taken inside a small rental cabin. Every plate on the dinner table still had food on it. 4 chairs were pushed neatly beneath the table. Their luggage remained unpacked in the bedrooms. Their phones were charging beside the beds. Their wallets were sitting on the kitchen counter. It looked as though the family had simply vanished in the middle of an ordinary evening. Missing persons cases were not unusual. Entire families disappearing without taking anything with them were. I asked what made the Bureau step in instead of leaving it with local law enforcement. My supervisor slid another folder toward me. Then another. By the time he finished stacking them, there were 9 identical case files sitting on my desk. 9 different families. 9 different cabins. 9 disappearances over the previous 7 years. Every cabin had been rented within the same 40-mile stretch of national forest. Every victim disappeared sometime between sunset and sunrise. Every cabin looked untouched when investigators arrived. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood, no fingerprints belonging to unknown suspects, no evidence of robbery. It was as though the victims had voluntarily walked away without shoes, phones, wallets, or jackets and had simply dissolved into the forest. I remember staring at the photographs for several minutes before asking the obvious question. "Has anyone searched the area properly?" My supervisor gave a tired smile. "Over 3,000 volunteers, search dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging, mounted patrols, drones, ground-penetrating radar in some locations. Nothing." I leaned back in my chair. Cases like this usually had patterns that pointed somewhere. Domestic violence, financial trouble, cult activity, organized crime, human trafficking, something. This one had nothing except geography. Every disappearance happened inside Black Cedar National Forest. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing witness interviews. Most were predictable. Campers who heard strange noises. Hunters who claimed they saw lights in the trees. Tourists who remembered unfamiliar vehicles parked along forest roads. Almost all of it was useless. Then I reached the final interview transcript in the newest file. It was conducted with an elderly volunteer firefighter named Frank Donnelly. He had helped search for the most recent family. During the interview, he told deputies something unusual. "You won't find them because you're looking in the wrong direction." The detective asked what he meant. Frank answered, "Everyone searches the woods. Nobody searches the town. I read that sentence twice before flipping through the remaining pages. Frank refused to explain further. 2 days after giving that interview, he disappeared from his own home. His front door was unlocked. His truck remained in the driveway. His breakfast was still sitting on the kitchen table. He became victim number 23. By that afternoon, I had assembled a small team consisting of 2 bureau agents, a forensic specialist, and a behavioral analyst. Standard procedure required us to coordinate with local law enforcement before assuming control of the investigation, so we drove 6 hours into Black Cedar County the following morning. The town looked exactly like hundreds of other mountain communities across America. 1 gas station, 1 grocery store, 1 diner, a sheriff's office barely larger than a convenience store. Population just under 1,100. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual. People waved as we drove past. Children rode bicycles through quiet neighborhoods. Elderly couples drank coffee outside the diner. It looked almost too peaceful. Sheriff Tom Hensley met us outside his office. He had been with the department for nearly 30 years and looked exhausted before we even introduced ourselves. His handshake was firm but distracted. He led us inside without wasting time on small talk. His office walls were covered with maps of the national forest. Hundreds of colored pins marked search locations. Every missing person's photograph had been pinned to a large corkboard beside his desk. He stood there staring at the board before speaking quietly. "I've looked for these people longer than some of my deputies have been alive." Nobody answered. We spent the next several hours reviewing reports. The sheriff had documented everything meticulously: tire impressions, weather conditions, wildlife activity, phone records, financial transactions. Nothing connected the victims except location. Around sunset, the sheriff suggested we continue the discussion over dinner at the only restaurant in town. It was a small family-owned place with maybe a dozen tables. As soon as we walked inside, the conversation stopped. Every person in the restaurant looked at us. Not for a second. Not casually. They watched us until we sat down. I noticed several people quietly leaving without finishing their meals. My behavioral analyst leaned toward me and whispered, "Either they hate federal agents or something else is going on." I nodded but said nothing. A waitress eventually approached carrying menus. Before handing me mine, she looked directly into my eyes and asked one strange question. "How long are you staying?" I told her probably a week, depending on what we found. She hesitated before quietly saying, "Don't make it 2." Then she walked away before I could ask what she meant. The sheriff pretended not to hear her, but I noticed him gripping his coffee cup much tighter than before. Dinner was mostly silent. Nobody in the restaurant laughed. Nobody lingered after finishing their food. By 8 o'clock, every table was empty except ours. As we walked outside, I noticed every porch light along Main Street had been switched on at exactly the same time. The sheriff caught me looking and simply said, "People here don't like the dark anymore." I asked why. He looked toward the forest instead of answering. "Tomorrow morning I'll take you to the latest cabin. You'll understand why this case never made sense." That night I checked into the small motel on the edge of town. Before going to sleep, I reviewed body camera footage from the original search teams. Most of it showed exactly what I expected. Dense forest, volunteers calling out names, search dogs weaving through undergrowth. Then one clip caught my attention. A deputy entered cabin 9 during the initial response. Everything looked ordinary until he walked past a hallway mirror. For less than a second, the mirror reflected someone standing behind him. The deputy never reacted because nobody was actually there when he turned around. I paused the footage and zoomed in repeatedly. The image became grainier each time, but the outline remained visible. A man wearing what appeared to be an old sheriff's uniform stood only a few feet behind the deputy. I checked the incident report. Only one deputy had entered the cabin at that moment. I replayed the footage again. The figure never moved. It simply stood there watching. I convinced myself it had to be a reflection artifact caused by low light and compression. That explanation made perfect sense. It was also the last logical explanation I would be able to give myself for a very long time. The next morning, I was awake before sunrise. Years in the bureau had trained my body to function on very little sleep, but that night I doubt I managed more than 2 hours. I kept replaying the body camera footage in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that motionless figure standing behind the deputy. By the time I walked outside the motel, the air was cold enough that my breath hung in front of me. The parking lot was almost empty except for our government SUVs and Sheriff Hensley's old pickup truck. He was already waiting beside it, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed me one without saying a word. We stood there in silence for almost a minute before he finally spoke. "You watched the footage, didn't you?" I nodded. "The mirror." He sighed quietly. "Every federal team notices it. Every one of them comes up with the same explanation." I asked him what his explanation was. He looked toward the mountains instead of answering. "I've stopped trying to explain things I can't prove." We left town just after 6. The latest cabin sat almost 20 miles into Black Cedar National Forest along a narrow dirt road that barely deserved to be called a road. Dense pine trees blocked most of the morning sunlight, making the drive feel much earlier than it actually was. Every few miles, we passed old trailheads with faded warning signs reminding visitors to stay on marked paths. Several signs had newer notices attached beneath them asking hikers to report suspicious activity immediately. One of my agents pointed out that every notice had been printed within the last 3 years. The sheriff simply nodded without taking his eyes off the road. About 40 minutes later, we reached the cabin. It looked exactly like the crime scene photographs. A small wooden rental overlooking a shallow creek surrounded by thick forest on all sides. Yellow crime scene tape still fluttered lazily across the porch even though weeks had passed since the disappearance. Our forensic specialist immediately began documenting the scene again while I walked slowly through each room. Cases like this often benefited from fresh eyes. Small details overlooked during earlier searches sometimes became obvious later. The living room looked untouched. 4 coffee mugs still sat on the table. A half-finished board game remained exactly where the family had left it. Children's jackets hung neatly beside the front door. Upstairs, the bedrooms looked equally ordinary. One bed had clearly been slept in, while another still held folded blankets at the foot. Family vacations always leave little signs of normal life behind. Toothbrushes beside sinks, shoes kicked beneath beds, open suitcases waiting to be unpacked. That ordinary feeling somehow made the silence inside the cabin much worse. It did not feel abandoned. It felt interrupted. I moved into the kitchen where our forensic specialist was dusting cabinet handles again, even though the original processing had already been completed. She looked up as I entered. "Nothing new so far." I nodded absent-mindedly and continued examining the room. Then something caught my attention. The wall calendar beside the refrigerator still displayed the month the family disappeared. One date had been circled in blue ink, the day after they vanished. I checked the booking records. Their reservation ended 3 days later. The circled date meant nothing on its own, but investigators are trained never to ignore habits. People circle birthdays, appointments, trips, important events. I photographed it before asking the sheriff whether anyone had contacted relatives about the calendar. He frowned. "I don't remember seeing that circle before." I showed him the wall. He stared at it for several seconds before quietly calling one of his deputies. 10 minutes later, the original crime scene photographs were pulled up on a laptop inside the cabin. Every picture clearly showed the calendar. None of them had a circle on that date. We compared every angle. Same calendar, same page, different marking. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, my forensic specialist suggested that someone involved in evidence processing may have accidentally written on it later. Reasonable explanation. Except the cabin had remained locked under continuous law enforcement control since the day of the disappearance. Every entry and exit had been logged. No one admitted touching the calendar. We collected it for laboratory analysis anyway. As the team continued processing the cabin, I stepped outside to examine the surrounding property. Search teams had thoroughly covered the immediate area, but I wanted to understand the terrain myself. The creek behind the cabin flowed gently through smooth rocks before disappearing into thicker woods. Several deer tracks crossed the muddy bank. Nothing unusual. About 50 yards farther, I found the remains of an old split-rail fence almost completely swallowed by vegetation. Beyond it, the forest changed noticeably. The trees grew closer together. The undergrowth became strangely sparse. Even the air felt cooler. I stopped walking when I noticed dozens of faded ribbons tied around tree branches. Red, Yellow, blue. Some looked old enough to have been hanging there for years. Others appeared much newer. At first, I assumed they were search markers left behind by volunteers. Then I realized something odd. Search teams use bright survey tape because it is highly visible. These ribbons looked like strips torn from clothing. Shirt sleeves, children's scarves, pieces of dresses. I called our forensic specialist over. She carefully collected several samples while photographing the area. One ribbon contained dried brown staining that immediately caught her attention. It would later test negative for blood. We never identified what the stain actually was. While she worked, I continued farther into the woods. About 200 yards from the cabin, I found an old stone foundation almost hidden beneath moss and fallen leaves. Whatever building had once stood there was long gone. Only scattered stones remained outlining what had probably been a small structure. I crouched beside one corner where something metallic reflected sunlight beneath layers of dirt. It turned out to be an old deputy's badge, corroded almost beyond recognition. The county name was still barely visible across the top. Black Cedar Sheriff's Office. I called Sheriff Hensley over. His face changed the moment he saw it. "That shouldn't be here." I asked why. He hesitated before answering. "Our department switched badge designs over 50 years ago." I asked if an old sheriff's office had once existed near the cabin. He slowly shook his head. "Not here." I asked where. He looked toward the distant tree line. "Right where the town cemetery is now." Before I could ask another question, one of my agents shouted from the cabin. We hurried back. He had discovered something hidden beneath loose floorboards inside the upstairs bedroom. It was a small metal lockbox wrapped in oilcloth. No mention of it appeared in previous reports. The lock had rusted enough that our evidence technician opened it within seconds. Inside were dozens of old photographs tied together with faded string. Most showed families standing outside rental cabins throughout different decades. Every family looked happy, smiling children. Parents holding fishing poles. Grandparents sitting on porches. Vacation pictures. Normal pictures. Then we noticed something disturbing. Every photograph had been taken at one of the missing persons' cabins. Every family and every photograph eventually disappeared. The oldest picture dated back to 1971. The newest had been taken less than a month before our investigation began. There were 43 photographs in total. Officially, only 23 disappearances had ever been linked to Black Cedar National Forest. That meant 20 more families had vanished without anyone connecting the cases. My behavioral analyst quietly counted the faces in each photograph before looking at me. "If these are all victims," he paused, "we're not investigating a series anymore." I asked him what he meant. He swallowed hard before answering. "We're investigating someone who's been doing this for nearly 50 years without making a single mistake." The room fell silent. Then Sheriff Hensley slowly picked up the oldest photograph. His hands began trembling. He turned it toward us without saying a word. Standing in the center of that 1971 family portrait was a uniformed deputy smiling directly at the camera. Every member of my team recognized him immediately. It was the same deputy we had seen standing silently behind the officer in the body camera mirror footage the night before. Only according to county employment records, the deputy in that photograph had officially died in the line of duty, 6 years before the picture was taken. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Every person in that room kept staring at the photograph, hoping one of us would notice something that made it less disturbing. I took the picture from the sheriff and examined it under natural light. It was an original print. The paper had aged naturally. The edges had yellowed. There were tiny cracks across the surface that matched photographs from the early 70s. It did not look manipulated. Our forensic specialist carefully placed it into an evidence sleeve before collecting the remaining photographs one by one. Every single picture had something in common besides the cabins. Somewhere in the background stood the same deputy. Sometimes he was standing beside a tree, sometimes near a vehicle, sometimes reflected in a window. He never smiled. He never acknowledged the camera. He was simply there, watching, hidden in plain sight. The sheriff looked pale. I asked him if he recognized the man. He nodded slowly. "Deputy Samuel Mercer." The name meant nothing to me. He continued speaking without taking his eyes off the photographs. He disappeared during a search operation in 1965. I frowned. You just said he died. The sheriff rubbed his forehead. That's what the official report says. Missing in the field for 7 days. Declared dead after they couldn't find him. Closed casket funeral. No body recovered. My behavioral analyst looked up immediately. Who was he searching for? The sheriff hesitated long enough that I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. A missing family. The room became completely silent. I asked how many people had disappeared before Mercer vanished. He walked toward the window and stared into the forest. 2 families. 6 people total. He was the lead deputy. Then he disappeared too. After that, more people kept vanishing every few years. My forensic specialist interrupted. Then why wasn't the case handed to federal authorities decades ago? The sheriff gave a bitter laugh. Because back then, missing hikers and missing hunters weren't unusual. Different counties handled different investigations. Nobody connected them until much later. I understood exactly what he meant. Before computerized databases became standard, it was surprisingly easy for patterns spanning decades to remain unnoticed, especially in isolated rural counties with limited resources. Still, something felt wrong. Someone had gone to great lengths to preserve those photographs beneath the cabin floor. That suggested planning, organization. Someone wanted them hidden but not destroyed. Before leaving the bedroom, I examined the floorboards more closely. Fresh tool marks surrounded the section where the lockbox had been concealed. They were recent, far newer than the rest of the wood. I pointed them out to the forensic specialist. She ran her fingers across the cuts before looking at me. These weren't made 50 years ago. I asked how recent. Within months, maybe even weeks. My stomach tightened. Someone had opened those floorboards shortly before the family disappeared. That meant whoever hid the photographs might still be alive. Or, at the very least, someone knew they were there. We immediately secured the cabin as an active crime scene again and requested additional personnel from the field office. While waiting for the response, I decided to revisit every witness interview from the latest disappearance. This time, I ignored timelines and focused only on names that appeared repeatedly. One name surfaced in nearly every report: Walter Briggs. According to statements, he owned the small hardware store in town. Search volunteers mentioned seeing him delivering supplies. Deputies interviewed him because he claimed to know several of the missing families. He had even repaired cabins throughout the forest for years. On paper, nothing about him seemed suspicious. In reality, he had access to almost every location connected to the disappearances. I asked Sheriff Hensley about him. Walter's lived here his whole life. He shrugged. Everyone knows him. I asked whether everyone trusted him. The sheriff paused. That's not exactly the same question. We drove back into town that afternoon. The hardware store sat on the corner across from the diner. Walter looked to be in his late 70s. Thin, quiet, friendly enough. He greeted us before we even reached the counter. Federal boys finally digging around. He smiled politely. Anything I can help with? His voice remained calm throughout the interview. He answered every question without hesitation. Yes, he had repaired cabins. Yes, he remembered several missing families. No, he had never noticed anything unusual. While we talked, I casually looked around the store. Hundreds of old photographs decorated the walls showing local history, logging crews, fishing tournaments, school graduations. Then I noticed one frame near the register. It showed the Black Cedar Sheriff's Office from the early 1960s. 5 deputies stood outside the building. One of them was Samuel Mercer. Walter caught me looking at the picture. "Good man," he said quietly. "Town was never the same after he disappeared." I asked whether they had been friends. Walter smiled faintly. Everybody was friends back then. His answer sounded rehearsed. Before leaving, I purchased a map of the National Forest mostly as an excuse to keep talking. As he folded it, he looked directly at me and asked a question that immediately put me on edge. "You staying at the motel?" I nodded. He continued folding the map without looking up. "Don't answer if somebody knocks after midnight." I asked why. He simply smiled. "You'll understand soon enough." As we walked outside, my partner muttered exactly what I had been thinking. Why does everyone in this town keep giving warnings instead of answers? Nobody had a response. That evening, we held a strategy meeting inside the sheriff's office. We pinned every photograph across an evidence board, arranging them by year. Patterns slowly began emerging. The same cabins appeared repeatedly. Different victims. Different decades. Same locations. Even stranger, every disappearance occurred within a 2-week period between late September and early October, never outside that window. Our behavioral analyst believed the offender likely lived locally and chose victims based on opportunity. It was a solid theory. Then, our forensic specialist entered, carrying the preliminary lab report on the calendar we had collected. Fingerprints belonged only to the missing family. The blue ink used to circle the date matched a pen found inside the cabin kitchen. No unknown DNA, no foreign prints. Nothing unusual, except for one detail. Chemical testing estimated the ink had been applied less than 48 hours before we removed the calendar. The family had disappeared almost 3 weeks earlier. Someone had entered the locked cabin after law enforcement secured it. Someone wearing gloves. Someone careful enough to leave no trace except a circle on a calendar that hadn't been there before. Before anyone could react, a deputy rushed into the conference room looking completely out of breath. He placed an evidence bag on the table without saying a word. Inside was a disposable camera covered in mud. He finally managed to catch his breath. Search volunteers found this buried beside an old fire road about a mile from Cabin 9. I asked whether it had been processed. He shook his head. Not yet. Our forensic specialist immediately removed the film and hurried to develop it using equipment at the local lab. We waited nearly an hour. It felt much longer. Finally, she returned carrying a fresh stack of photographs. The first few showed ordinary vacation pictures taken by the missing family. Children fishing. Parents cooking dinner. Forest trails. Then the mood changed. One photo captured the trees outside their cabin just after sunset. Another showed the same area 30 minutes later. At first, nothing seemed different. Then, I noticed a figure standing between the trees. Too far away to identify. The following picture had been taken only seconds later. The figure was much closer. The next photograph showed it standing at the edge of the porch. The face remained too blurry to identify, but the uniform was unmistakable. Sheriff's deputy. The final photograph stopped every conversation in the room. It had clearly been taken from inside the cabin through the front window. Deputy Samuel Mercer stood on the porch looking directly into the camera. One hand rested against the glass. Behind him, standing perfectly still in the darkness, were at least 15 other people. Men, women, children. Every one of them matched victims from earlier missing persons reports. None of them had aged a single day. And scratched across the bottom edge of the photograph in fresh handwriting were 5 words that had not appeared in any previous evidence. "You should have left yesterday." Nobody in the room moved. The only sound was the old fluorescent light buzzing above our heads. I kept staring at the last photograph, trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe someone had staged it. Maybe the image had been altered before the film was developed. But deep down, I already knew neither explanation fit. Disposable cameras are simple. They do not edit themselves. They capture exactly what is in front of the lens. Our forensic specialist immediately took the negatives to verify that the image had not been manipulated. 20 minutes later, she returned looking more unsettled than I had seen her during my entire career. She placed the negatives on the table. "The photograph is genuine." Nobody said anything. My partner finally broke the silence. "Then someone dressed as Mercer." The sheriff slowly shook his head. "That uniform hasn't existed since 1964. I looked back at the photograph. The badge, the shoulder patches, even the patrol car parked faintly behind him matched historical records we had already reviewed. Whoever stood on that porch either had access to museum-quality replicas or something far stranger was happening. I refused to accept the second possibility. Cases are solved with evidence, not imagination. That principle had guided my career, and I wasn't about to abandon it now. I asked everyone to focus on facts. We enlarged the photograph and projected it onto the conference room wall. The image quality improved just enough to reveal another detail. The people standing behind Mercer were not looking at the camera. Every single one of them was looking slightly to the left as though watching something just outside the frame. I measured the angle using reference points from the porch. Whatever had their attention would have been standing directly beside the photographer, beside the missing father. My behavioral analyst quietly whispered, "He wasn't photographing them." I looked at him. He pointed toward the image. He was photographing whatever they were looking at. The room fell silent again. We immediately searched the remaining photographs from the disposable camera, hoping the missing frame might reveal more. The camera should have held 27 exposures. Only 26 photographs existed. One frame was completely blank. The lab confirmed the film had advanced normally, but nothing had developed on that exposure except solid black. It was as though the camera had captured darkness itself. Late that evening, I decided to revisit the original sheriff's office records dating back to the 1960s. Most had been moved into a dusty archive room beneath the courthouse. Sheriff Hensley unlocked the storage area while complaining that nobody had entered it in years. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling packed with old evidence boxes and faded case files. The smell of mold and old paper filled the air. We spent nearly 3 hours reading reports from Deputy Mercer's investigation. Most of them matched what little we already knew. 2 families disappeared. Massive search operation. Mercer vanished during the search. Then I found something strange. A handwritten notebook tucked inside an unmarked evidence envelope. It wasn't part of the official file. There was no evidence tag, no catalog number. The first page simply read, "Personal notes, Samuel Mercer." Every page after that became increasingly unsettling. Mercer described hearing people walking around his campsite at night despite finding no tracks the following morning. He wrote about interviewing local residents who refused to enter certain parts of the forest after sunset. He mentioned seeing abandoned patrol vehicles that somehow vanished before backup arrived. At first, his notes sounded like an exhausted deputy documenting strange observations. Then the entries became increasingly paranoid. He claimed someone was following every search team from a distance just beyond visual range. Several deputies laughed at him according to his own writing. Then one by one, those same deputies reportedly admitted seeing the same thing. The final completed page stopped me cold. October 3rd, 1965. If anyone reads this, then I failed. We are searching for missing families, but I no longer believe they are the victims. I think they are the witnesses. Something happened here long before any of us arrived. The town knows more than they admit. If I disappear, do not continue my search after dark. It wants investigators more than tourists. The remaining pages had been ripped out, not torn naturally, cut cleanly with a knife. I asked the sheriff whether he had ever seen the notebook before. He shook his head slowly. Never. Before we could examine it further, every light in the archive room suddenly went out. Complete darkness swallowed the basement. Someone upstairs shouted that the entire building had lost power. Emergency lights should have activated automatically. They didn't. I switched on my flashlight. The narrow beam illuminated rows of silent shelves disappearing into darkness. Sheriff Hensley reached for his radio. Nothing but static. My own radio produced the same result. We started toward the stairs. Halfway there, I heard footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps echoing somewhere deeper inside the archive. I stopped walking. The others heard them too. They were too heavy to belong to a rat or loose pipes. Someone else was down there with us. I called out, identifying myself as FBI. No response. The footsteps continued for several more seconds before stopping. We swept the flashlight beams across the aisles. Empty. I moved carefully between 2 shelving units following the sound. The farther I walked, the colder the basement became. Then my flashlight landed on something lying in the middle of the concrete floor. A sheriff's hat. Old style. Covered in dust. I recognized it instantly from historical photographs. It matched Deputy Mercer's uniform. I bent down to examine it. Fresh dirt clung to the brim as though it had only recently been dropped. Then another sound echoed behind me. Someone cleared their throat. I spun around, raising my flashlight. Nobody. Just endless shelves filled with forgotten evidence. My heartbeat hammered inside my ears. "Did one of you just move?" I called out. My voice echoed through the basement. Sheriff Hensley answered from somewhere near the staircase. "We're over here." His voice sounded farther away than it should have. I hurried back toward it. When I reached the stairs, both he and my partner were standing exactly where I had left them. They looked confused. My partner frowned. "Who were you talking to?" I told him I had called out after hearing someone behind me. He stared at me for several seconds before quietly replying, "We heard you talking." I asked what he meant. He swallowed hard. "We heard your voice having a conversation with someone. We couldn't understand the words. We thought you had found another deputy." Every muscle in my body tightened. I knew I had not spoken to anyone. Before I could respond, the courthouse lights suddenly came back on. The basement returned to normal. Radios crackled to life. Everything looked ordinary again except for one detail. The sheriff's hat was gone. I walked back to the exact spot where I had found it. Empty floor. No dust disturbed. No hat, nothing. I searched the surrounding aisles twice. Nothing. We left the archive room carrying Mercer's notebook and locked the basement behind us. As we reached the parking lot, the dispatcher called over the sheriff's radio. Her voice shook so badly she could barely finish the sentence. "Sheriff, we just got another missing persons call." Hensley asked where. There was a long pause before she answered. "Room 12. Pine Ridge Motel." My blood ran cold. That was my room. I had checked out that morning. The dispatcher continued speaking. "Housekeeping found an occupied room. Bags are still inside. Clothes laid out on the bed. Wallet, phone, everything." Another pause. No sign of the guest. I slowly looked down at my own hands. My wallet was still in my pocket. My phone was in my jacket. I was standing in the courthouse parking lot. Yet, according to the dispatcher, I had already disappeared.